Chapter 6. Georges. The sun was barely peeping over the summit of the dark hill as Reuben called everyone to awake. Beasts and plants rose and took food. More forest peas, discovered Felicity. It seemed they simply ate one food from each area in which they travelled. They didn't seem to carry much at all, just a few coverings and containers. She watched carefully but couldn't see any evidence of secreted food, or weapons, thankfully. It made travelling so easy, and there was absolute trust that the land would provide each day. Felicity thought of her world as it was now. Food travelling backwards and forwards across its surface aimlessly, mountains of waste rotting in stinking heaps, people starving in countries affected by climate or wars. She sat up. How I wish we'd remembered some of this simplicity. Reuben approached and held out his hand to help her rise. I hear some of your thoughts, Felicity, he said. You must accept that even in your world there's a plan. I feel your sadness and despair. But life is joy, and all will balance somewhere for those concerned. Maybe not in your world, but in another world that you have yet to discover. Never despair. It's extinguished energy. Felicity took his hand and slowly let the breath go she'd subconsciously been holding. As she exhaled, she felt the despair leave. There's always hope, she thought, and beauty, even if it takes a little time to find it. She thought of the wonderful givers of her world, those who gave all their time and lives to helping the plants, the beasts, the people. Yes, there's balance, she replied, but in my world it's sometimes hard to find. Reuben offered her some of the cool green liquid they'd washed the spicy peas down with last night, and she sipped a little before asking, Reuben, what are the aquatics? The drink chilled her stomach as she drank some more. It tasted so refreshing. She felt it cleanse her from the inside. A little burp bubbled up, and she struggled to keep it down, panicking that Reuben would hear. But he was brushing out the last traces of the fire whilst he spoke. We have a very long day, Felicity. I will let Sib tell you about the aquatics. He will enjoy sharing his knowledge with you. As they began to climb the dense forest path, Reuben called Sib to walk by Felicity. Well, Felicity, where do I start? Said Sib. He sounded a little irritated, and Felicity wondered why. He spoke quickly. The aquatics grow at the edges of all our waters. Their main growth is in the warm western lagoons and lakes close to the oceans where their enharmonics, the oceanids, live. But their tuberous shoots spread out across the whole world in a vast mat. Their hollow tubers sift the water in which they float, and as all that happens leaves its traces upon the earth, by nightfall so too they gather information along with their nutrients. Our world is full of water, oceans and rivers, cascading waterfalls and streams, tiny rivulets. Into each and all the aquatics have their tendrils. They are the interconnecting web of communication of our lands. At that instant a loud rumbling reached their ears. Sib stopped scuffling, and Felicity instinctively crouched down. They were deep in the forest, and the noise was deafening. The ground shook. Felicity looked about her. The left bank was still covered in dense vegetation, no escape there. To the right were glistening green banks. It seemed to be a bulge of rock covered in water that only allowed this slimy plant to grow. Reuben was shouting instructions up ahead as the vibrations intensified. Felicity looked at Sib. Scaly head stretched to the length of his muscled neck. His nostrils flared as he tried to catch a scent. The two Lupata had gone to the front of the trail. They stood upright, heads raised and teeth bared, ready to defend. The tall greens stood either side of the troop, branches linked, a daisy chain of protection. The other plants and beasts huddled hopelessly in the centre. Felicity and Sib brought up the rear. Gus had quietly moved into position about 100 feet back. How on earth did he manage that? She quickly looked forwards again as Reuben shouted to the terrified group, "Stand still and wait for my instructions." His voice sounded strong and confident in the shady pass. Felicity saw him stride forwards towards the terrible noise. The two lupata shadowed him closely. Another two creatures Felicity did not recognize moved forwards to take up their defensive positions. Reuben rounded a bend, and she saw him no more. The rumbling and thudding ceased about 2 minutes later. The ground stopped shuddering. There was silence. Only a bird singing high in the trees was audible. Gus coughed gently behind them. He had quietly approached. Felicity looked directly into his big black eyes. They seemed calm. Her shoulders relaxed. "Have a drink, Felicity," he said gently. He held out a container. It was beautiful. Woven-coloured leaves covered in some sort of shiny glaze. Felicity took a sip. It was not the amber liquid of her first night, nor the cool green drink of the forest. It was sweet and yet spicy. She took a little more. "Thank you," she said. She heard some muttering from up ahead and peered at the spot where Reuben had disappeared. He reappeared, smiling, and just after him arrived the most incredible creature. It was huge. It seemed to block out the sky as it rounded the bend. It took a few moments to take in its scale. "A toro!" exclaimed Sib beside her. The toro walked slowly, yet Felicity could now hear the thud as its feet touched the ground. "It looks like an overfed bull," she said. "A bull?" said Gus. "What's a bull?" "No, hang on," she said, rudely ignoring Gus in her fascination. "No, it's too hairy, too massive. It's like one of those pictures in history books of woolly mammoths, only bigger. So much bigger," she said, inadvertently stepping back into one of Gus's spines. "Ow," she said, rubbing the back of her arm. Sib smiled. "Friends and followers," said Reuben. "We have a toro joining us. He will make his own introduction, of course." "Good afternoon, dear quest troop and followers," began the toro, his booming voice causing the poor colour changers to fly up into the air involuntarily. "I most humbly apologise if my haste alarmed you. I understand from Reuben 4000th that I caused a little shake on the forest floor. For that, accept my sincerest apologies. I was keen to find you before dusk," he said. The fur on his neck formed a fat, luxuriant cuff. His body was deep, red-brown, dense, tangled, matte. What a glorious colour! Like a winter fox, thought Felicity. His head was so big it made Reuben standing beside him look like a child, and the lupata who had seemed so large stood like tiny collie dogs at his heels. "Now that is an aged toro," said Gus. "How old do you estimate, Toxic?" said Sib. Felicity realised it was probably the first time she'd heard anyone other than Reuben talk to Gus. "I should think he's the largest part of a whole generation," replied Gus, assessing the toro. Felicity chewed her bottom lip, but stood firm. When she was really small, she'd watched a herd of bulls snorting and roaring as they ran past her in the street in southern Spain. She'd told Al once, and Al snorted with delight as yet another inappropriate thing her parents had taken her to. But actually she couldn't remember being scared or scarred, just overwhelmed by the colour and the roars of the crowd lining the pavements. She studied this magnificent beast as the images returned. What would Al call him, she wondered. Georges with an S, she pronounced with satisfaction. I beg your pardon, Felicity, said Gus. The male taureau prides himself on his attraction for females, said Sib, smirking. Although this one, whilst being the largest I have ever witnessed, is also the ugliest I've ever seen. Felicity looked at Sib. His scaly eyes were wrinkled in delight as he shuffled from one short, fat leg to the other. Gus and Sib joined Reuben, who beckoned them all forwards, and Felicity reluctantly followed. Felicity, Gus and Sib, I present to you Taureau 2524th, he said. The taureau dipped his head in greeting. This was not a fast act. First he moved one leg in front of the other. Then he shook his huge head and ever so slowly lowered it towards the earth until only the dark, woolly jungle right between his ears was facing them. He snorted with the effort, and a group of colour changers were blown high into the sky. Everyone laughed, and the taureau straightened up. He looked straight at Felicity. Felicity joins our quest from afar, finished Georges, still scrutinising Felicity. His eyes were a deep green and a little cloudy, but the expression in them was not. Felicity felt herself blush. It is an honour to meet such a fine young creature, he said gallantly. I'm happy to meet you, sir, she replied. May I call you a more simple name? He bowed his head in agreement. Then I shall call you Georges, she said. Reuben hesitated, but as the taureau said no more, he continued, and she finds our names difficult. He looked up through the trees at the paling sky. The hour grows late, and we must reach the waters by nightfall. We shall all call you Georges henceforth, with your permission. Taureau 2524th. Now let's walk and talk. Everyone seemed eager to move off. The day had been long and exciting. Felicity wondered what food they would eat at the next camp. In front, the landscape opened into a vast grey plain. But in the distance, Felicity saw a sparkle and smiled. Yes, Felicity, we reach the waters at last, said Reuben, appearing as he always did without her noticing. She'd missed him today. He wasn't very good at keeping his word to stay by her side. His mouth lifted in a mischievous grin, and she felt a bit strange. She shivered. I miss your company too, said his voice into her head, and then he continued aloud, but this trail throws new challenges each day. Why is Georges here? Asked Felicity. As if he was inside her head even when she wasn't aware of her thoughts, he replied, Georges was travelling before seeking a new mate, as his lifelong partner was lost many years ago. He says the rumours he hears are very worrying. Has he heard of danger then? Felicity asked. She was still not sure how she felt about this mountain of a beast, in spite of his twinkly eyes. But if there was close danger, she was glad to have him too. No, don't be scared. We shall be far from any TOXICS for now. No, this natural desire to preserve the old world, which is inherent in a taureau, simply prompted him to divert his journey to join us for a time, I think. He hasn't mentioned danger. His knowledge and strength are an unexpected gift, Felicity. I hope to persuade him to stay with us as long as possible, in spite of the Taurels. Reuben's mouth lifted at one corner. Could you tell me more of Georges' kind? Asked Felicity, enjoying his company and determined to keep him by her side a little longer. Well, the taureau are respected for their strength, their stamina, their stoicism, and they can carry wisdom. They and not the Lupata are chosen to guard the sacred caves, because their strength, endurance and stability outweighs the fiery nature of the Lupata. Felicity was tired. Every question was answered with another mystery. What were the sacred caves exactly? Why did they need guarding? Felicity sighed. It was hard not to think of home at times like this. How long would she have to be in this world? Would she ever be allowed home? A chill crept up her spine. She actually felt the hairs on her arms lift. She glanced at Reuben, who was marching beside her. His profile was strong against the darkening sky. The bump on his nose fascinated her. She realised she was smiling. I'm terrified one minute and dreaming of kissing his nose the next. The thought came unbidden to her mind. Oh no, he's smiling now. Could he hear my thoughts? Did I conceal them? Flustered, she strode forwards to catch up with Gus, who was trundling ahead of them. As they crossed the slightly boggy plain, darkness fell. There was not much conversation. The Lupata led the group. Georges walked at the side of Reuben. The noise of his feet striking the ground was deadened in this boggy landscape, but the squelching was sufficiently loud. The thick fogs of before had not descended, but a clinging mist was rising from the earth. Oh, this endless marching, thought Felicity. Georges decided to sing to cheer her up. He could feel her misery and wanted her to admire his deep, wonderful voice. Lo, 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 he sang in a deep boom. Felicity surreptitiously stuck her fingers in her ears. He wouldn't see in the gloom, she thought, not wanting to offend this proud old beast. His song lasted until they reached the water's edge. Reuben and Georges organised the camp. Sib and Gus worked together to begin a fire from the driftwood on the beach. The Lupata scavenged for sand shoots, and the colour changers flew about distributing them. Felicity clutched her handful and bit into one. It was chewy and tasted a little like licorice. It was dark grey and not attractive, but it was the best thing she'd ever eaten at that moment. Everyone sat or lay or leaned or piled up and chewed their sticks. The Lupata swallowed them whole. The greens licked them delicately. She and Reuben chewed them slowly. Georges ate his entire supply in one mouthful and went in search of more. Felicity didn't like to ask how the leafy colour changers ate, but of course Reuben was there in her head. They only require liquid, he explained. It supplies them with all they need. When you're satisfied, Felicity, please sleep. You've done so well. Your kind are stronger than they look, he said, and reached out to touch her with a pat of reassurance, but found himself gently stroking her hair. Felicity was quite pleased with her hair. It was a grubby blonde colour, but it was thick and grew fast. Its curl was enough to annoy her, and enough to make her mother smile when she brushed it. It reached just above her waist and bounced when she walked. Reuben had been watching it with fascination for the last 2 days. The Orion hair was long and strong also, but it was dead straight. He tied his back with a woven cord. Reuben stroked her curls for a moment longer, and Felicity allowed it. She lay down with a sigh, and Reuben felt Sib staring at him. He returned the gaze, his eyes steady and clear of expression. Sib looked away. Then Reuben left Felicity and strode amongst the weary travellers, ensuring everyone was settled. When he returned, she was almost asleep. Sleep well, little Felicity, he murmured, as he finally lay down himself. His face was serious. For tomorrow we cross the seas to the temperate north, and there I am not sure what to expect, he murmured. Watching the flames gently flicker, his thoughts took him back to his home, to Orion country and the Orion women. He was ready to find his enharmonic, he knew. He felt the need within him. It was time to become mature.